Anna, do you still have snow on the ground?
No, they're still getting it in Northwest Minnesota, but the metro area, St. Paul, Minneapolis, we've been bare for a while.
Wow.
It's pretty weird.
Yeah,
It's
it's
pretty
very.
weird. Yeah.
Yeah, usually you're buried.
Yes, yes. Usually this is the time of year where you really regret the shoveling job you did in December because it created some ice that you're still dealing with. But that hasn't happened this year. No regrets.
Okay, if Mary doesn't join, maybe we should go with Anna and then Doug and then just open the floor for question and answers. I bet they will have a lot of questions today.
Already started the webinar.
You ready for me? Or are we going to do some intro slides?
We're gonna introduce some intro slides.
Okay, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this this series last webinar. Today we have what's the beef with soil health and livestock topic. And there are some housekeeping items. So we are offering one soil and water management CCA credit at the end of this session. And this session will be recorded and available at agcrops.osu.edu. Please feel free to submit your question at any time using question and answer chat feature at the bottom of your screen. You can also email questions to Rachel Cochran at cochran.474@osu.edu. So we will use that chat feature and pull questions to get feedback from you. So also we would like to know from where you are joining today. So mention your city and state in the chat panel. So today's speaker, we have Dr. Anna Cates, Dr. Mary Drewnoski, and Dr. Douglas Jackson-Smith. Manbir, can you go introduction of these speakers?
So, good morning, everyone. Very glad to have our speakers on board with us today. Our very first speaker is Dr. Anna Cates. She is the State Soil Health Specialist in Minnesota Office for Soil Health. She's also assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Cates' research focuses on soil organic matter cycling and storage in a variety of cropping systems. She received a PhD in agronomy and an MS in soil science and agroecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Cates, do you want to go ahead and share your slides?
Sure. So yeah, you got the basic background on me. I always introduce myself as an extension soil scientist, and I'm going to start with some real basics about soil and then get into how the livestock affect things. I am part of this Office for Soil Health we have in Minnesota that works to improve water quality by increasing adoption of soil health practices. We're funded by some state dollars as well as the university. So that's basically what I said. We're going to cover some soil stuff, what we know about how manure changes soil health metrics, and what we know about how livestock systems change soil carbon stocks and cycling. So starting with just what is soil, hopefully some of you have seen this before, but we think of soil as essentially half solids and half space. So this pie chart shows how the solids are mostly mineral with a little bit of organic matter, and the space can be filled with air or water depending on conditions. This picture gets a little bit more detailed in terms of what it looks like for those spaces to be filled with air and water. The spaces, the pores are different sizes. They might be connected to each other. They might be isolated. When I see images like this as a soil scientist, I get really excited and fascinated because soil is so heterogeneous. And what's happening right here in terms of microbial life or nutrient cycling is going to be really different than what's happening here or here, even though this image is on the micro scale, right? These things are less than a millimeter apart from each other. So that's important to know when we think about how we measure soil, how we think about how soil behaves. The other piece that's important is to think about the biology. So the elements that I mentioned before, that's the structure, and this is the biology. This is who lives there. So this is a little food web in the soil, which shows a plant as the, beginning of the food web, just like above ground. Plants are the only ones that can pull energy from the sun and the air and create food for other organisms. So you have worms living on that. You have microbes as terms of these little squiggles living on that. And then you have larger organisms that are eating the microbes and also some of the plant material. So when you get a number that's like 4% organic matter, it's actually representing all these organisms, all these processes, and a lot of different elements, not just dead plants when you see that percent organic matter number. But where those organisms live is really determined by your soil texture. So I think many of you have probably seen the sand, silt, and clay triangle, and you might know whether you're on a silt loam or a sandy clay or what have you. That's what you guys should ask at the beginning, not what town are you in, but what soil type are you on right now? That would be a good way to get a sense of where everybody's coming from. Because for the microbes, this really determines where they can live. Clay ends up to be the juiciest area of habitat or real estate in the soil because it has a lot of surface area. This image shows a zoomed in picture of the clay surface, which has a lot of nooks and crannies and folds. Water sticks there, organic matter sticks there. You have more pore space in clays, so you have a little bit more oxygen and more water sticking around. And so the more clay you have, that's why you have more organic matter and more clay-rich soils, because it just has all this surface area places for that stuff to stick to. The next level up of organization after just clay with organic matter stuck to it is what we call soil aggregates. And I have a cartoon image here, and I have a real image of what soil aggregation looks like. So in the cartoon image, you can see those spaces I'm talking about, that's the white, and you can kind of see smaller packets of what I call carbon-coated clay, smaller micro aggregates, and then they're held together in larger aggregates, macro aggregates, and then it starts to look more like this picture on the left, where you have stringy stuff actually holding them together. So when we think about a healthy soil, we want to have these aggregates because they protect organic matter inside. So they're kind of a home for microbes and a place to protect organic matter. Here's another image of that which is made via a bunch of x-rays of an aggregate. So in this case, the gray is the mineral material, the blue is the air or water, the pore space, and then the brown is the organic matter. And again, this image shows how heterogeneous it is just across a really tiny aggregate. The scale bar here is 100 microns, and your pencil lead is about 5 millimeters. So 100 micron is a tenth of a millimeter. That's a tenth of a fifth of your pencil lead. Very small. But this organization at the small scale builds up to that organization you can see in your hand, like I showed in the last slide. And why do we care about having these aggregates around? Well, I want to talk about how the biological function affects the physical function of soil. In this image, you can see poorly aggregated soil on your left, where you look down at the surface and it's really smooth, and then a well-aggregated soil on your right, where you look down at the surface and it's crumbly. It has chunks of different sizes, those heterogeneous aggregates I was talking about. The bottom part of the image is essentially a cutaway where this is the soil surface and the blue lines represent water coming in. And on the left, you have water trying to get in through these very small spaces. Anybody who's farming some heavy clay soils, which I'm sure there are some in Ohio, knows what this is like. When you have water trying to get into small spaces, you have slow infiltration. When you have that clay aggregated into larger particles, then you are able to create some macropores where water can flow in between those spaces. It's the difference between a room full of marbles where the spaces between them are all small and a room full of beach balls where the spaces between them are large. If you're starting with sandy soil, this isn't your problem, right? You're already starting with good infiltration, but aggregates can still help you. I want to make that point. When we think about the functions we want from soil, we want both this infiltration function and we also want the water storage function. And the infiltration function demands these big pores, and then the storage function requires small pores. But you get that inside your aggregates, those little blue elements that I showed you in the X-ray. You can see all those tiny pores inside. So soil structure aggregation, which you can protect by reducing tillage and you can increase by having a living root in the ground, Those things can give you both those storage functions and that infiltration function. Here's just one more little set of video image showing the difference between a poorly structured soil and a well-structured soil. These were taken just after a little training exercise with this Cornell infiltrometer. And so at the bottom of this cylinder, there's some little hoses that rain on the surface of the soil. We rained on the soil for maybe 25 minutes, not hard, on a heavily tilled soil on the left and an untilled soil on the right. And we essentially see really different responses, where on the left, you just have this jello patty. It can't take in any more water. It is completely dissolved in terms of having structure. And on the right, you have something that still looks like soil. You can still see those big cracks where water can continue to enter. So it's able to take in a lot more water because of that good structure. I think that this image really makes it really clear what we think about when we think about a healthy soil. Nobody really wants to be doing anything with this soil on the left except making mud pies in the garden. So it's almost better than any indicator of organic matter or anything else. All right, I'm gonna get into the livestock element. The livestock are one of the soil health principles we talk about, and I'm kind of going to justify why we keep them on this list that otherwise focuses on the two elements I talked about, keeping the soil covered and minimizing disturbance to protect what structure you have, and increasing your crop diversity and your living roots in order to build soil structure. So what happens when we add livestock to this pyramid? Well, it really can change the biological input substantially, and it tends to change the soil organic matter. There was a review of this I'm going to show a few figures from because there hasn't been a ton of work done on exactly what manure does to soil health properties. And this one, I'm just going to focus on the organic matter. They separated a lot of studies out and combined them into this one graph, separating the treatments into inorganic fertilizer, liquid swine manure, solid swine manure, and manure with a combination of inorganic fertilizer as well. And they saw, almost a 25% increase in soil organic matter with the solid swine manure treatment, as well as the manure plus inorganic fertilizer. And I've seen other studies that looked at this combination of manure and inorganic fertilizer, and it can be really powerful. It kind of gives the plant both that long-term and the short-term nutrient needs. The other way they broke this out is looking at different soil types. So I showed that soil texture triangle early on because you can't change what soil type you start with, and it can make a big difference in terms of what outcomes you see. And they showed higher changes and increases in organic matter in their medium and finer textured soils. And then they also broke out the data by time. So manure application is something that's going to compound in terms of its ability to increase your organic matter. Sometimes in some of the research trials I've worked on, we've been working on old dairy farm soils, and sometimes we're still looking at this change in organic matter that occurred over decades of manure application and is still kind of slowly being drawn down. If any of you have, that field close to the barn where manure was hauled for a couple of generations, then you know what I'm talking about. It builds up over time, and then it sticks around for some time too. This study didn't have as many physical properties that they measured, but they saw generally positive effects of manure on bulk density. In this case, they actually saw the biggest difference in sandy soils, different than the organic matter treatment. They didn't do a lot of measurements of infiltration, but they did see increases in infiltration with manure, probably because manure is boosting that biology and helping to improve soil structure. So in my world, I work a lot with row crops, and we think a lot about how to integrate cover crops as a soil health practice. And I'm just showing this timeline from a study we did where they were able to apply manure after the cover crops. This is from Manny Saba and Melissa Wilson. And, it's really can be really tricky to time your manure spreading needs with your cover cropping needs. But I just want to point out that it can be really successful to add manure and even incorporate it lightly after that rye cover crop is already growing. This is a before and after where the rye really completely recovered from manure application. The last thing I want to talk about briefly is soil carbon credits. So there's a lot of information out there right now about how to build your soil carbon and ways to get paid for soil carbon credits. So I'm just going to show a little data about the inputs and outputs of carbon in an ag system and how manure might change that. So essentially, all the inputs to soil carbon are coming from photosynthesis or manure, and then the outputs are mostly microbial respiration and harvest. So microbial respiration being they're eating carbon dioxide and breathing out, I'm sorry, eating food and breathing out carbon dioxide, probably like some of you are with your breakfast right now. Manure, there we go. I have it on there. I'm going to skip these and just go straight to this ins and outs figure. So this is a system where they used an eddy covariance tower to measure all the carbon going in and out of a dairy rotation in Minnesota at a couple different locations. And you can see they have the different cropping systems separated in each panel. The blue represents the carbon gained in photosynthesis. So you can see that corn and alfalfa have more carbon inputs than soybean, right? Soybean's a smaller plant, has less carbon going into the system. And then the yellow represents carbon either respired by those microbes or harvested. So the combine takes off a lot of carbon from the system. And then the manure is this little blue bar here that goes into the alfalfa and the silage made parts of the system. And it doesn't really make up for the amount of respiration and harvest you have, especially in a system like silage, where you're pulling off almost all of the plant that grows, and in a system like alfalfa, where again, the purpose of the system is to pull off biomass. So overall, all of our balance is this red. The red represents the blue minus the yellow, and in most cases, it's quite negative or overlapping with zero in our grain carbon system. So we're just pulling off too much of the plant biomass to really get ahead on soil carbon. But there is glimmers of hope. These figures show that the carbon balance on top increases with your residue carbon. So the more residue you leave behind, the closer you're getting to that positive or neutral carbon balance. And then on the bottom, they have a metric where they put the manure carbon over the harvested carbon. So the ratio of manure to harvested carbon, and where you got close to replacing almost half of that harvested carbon with manure, then again, you're approaching that zero carbon balance. So the manure could be an ingredient that keeps our soil carbon steady. I'm not going to say from the data that we see a lot of opportunity to increase it, but we're able to keep it steady with that. So these are my takeaways. I'll be on at the end of the panel for questions. Manure is generally good for soil organic matter and microbes. It gives microbes another source of food besides plants. Changes tend to be slow. And integrating these livestock and manure into a soil health system can be a challenge in terms of the timing with the cover crop, but it usually pays off, which I think some of my co-panelists will talk about a little bit more. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Cates. Our next speaker is Dr. Drewnoski. She is an associate professor and extension beef specialist at the University of Nebraska. Her research and extension program focus on utilization of crop residues and cover crop forage for backgrounding calves and feeding beef cows. Dr. Drewnoski also serves on an interdisciplinary team evaluating economic systems for integrated crop and livestock production in Nebraska. Dr. Drewnoski, would you mind sharing your screen now?
Are we good? Okay. So I'm going to kind of take a little bit different approach. I am not a soil scientist. I am a ruminant nutritionist. I sometimes pretend to be an agronomist a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've learned as we've been trying to integrate crops and cattle production. And so the question that I often get, right, is, can I have my cake and eat it too? So if I have the cover crops and then I graze them, do I negate the benefits of the cover crop? Do I increase the benefits of the cover crop? So we're going to explore a little bit about what we've learned so far. I still think there's a lot of questions, particularly about management, that we need to continue to dive into. Before we move there, though, I would be remiss if I didn't say that if you're thinking about trying to use cover crops for forage and you want to graze them, then species selection is extremely important, because you really need to make sure you're going to get enough mass, so biomass, for there to be something to graze. And so timing of planting and what you select is extremely important to achieving those goals. Now, some places have it easier than others. You go further south, it's a little bit easier because you have more growing degree days. The further north in the US you go, it's a little harder. And so the specific species for the specific timing will depend on where you're at, of course. I will say across the board though, grasses are king when it comes to biomass production. So don't skimp on the grass if you're looking for forage. I also wanted to point out, this is probably one of the things that has stuck with me about cover crops in particular, is that what you see above ground doesn't tell you everything about what's going on below ground. And we went out to this field out in central Nebraska where they had planted soybeans, or they had planted rye after soybeans. And in early March, you know, the rye's 3 inches tall, so it doesn't look like much is going on. And we probed through that rye, and there was a live root down to 30 inches. We did that at multiple places. And even in between, these were 15-inch rows. The planter that he used, he didn't have a very dense stand. Even in between those, you could see him down to 26 inches. So there's a lot of stuff going on, especially in these winter hardy species, that's happening in that fall period while they're getting ready to kind of to go dormant, that can be really beneficial in terms of the soil, because that live root is there's a much more going on with this live root than what we would expect given the 3 inches of the biomass above ground. I also kind of want to point out that a lot of people think about, you know, if we hay or we do silage, we are removing carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, we're removing nutrients. But with grazing, it's a different story, right? So with grazing, a lot of what we are actually having cattle consume is going back out the back end. So it's important to understand when we're thinking about carbon, for instance, that a lot of the carbon that becomes soil stable carbon is from the roots. And what comes from above is probably only about, like in oat systems, we see about 30% comes from the above ground biomass, and about 70% of the soil stable carbon is coming from the roots. If we then go and say we're going to graze this above ground biomass, yes, we're going to have less material that is being trampled, less material that is left on the soil surface. However, we have something that's kind of a benefit to us, and that is, as was kind of pointed out by Ann, the manure. So in the case of manure, there's actually a higher contribution of the carbon that is in manure that contributes to soil stable carbon. So in the end, even if we are grazing 70% of the top growth of oats, let's say as our cover crop, we're still capturing almost 90% of the soil stable carbon compared to ungrazed cover crop. So I think from this instance, yes, we can have our cake and eat it too. Now, this assumes that we are grazing our management such that we do not have erosion, right? That we still have enough cover to prevent erosion. So I think that is important. I also kind of wanted to just dive just a second into corn residue grazing, because that was actually where we started, and I realized that is pretty much a Nebraska thing. There is some more in the Midwest, but I think it helps you to understand integration of cattle in particular onto cropland. And so I'm going to focus here in eastern Nebraska and talk a little bit about some of the research. And this name might be familiar to some of you. But one of the things that we did was we had a study that had been going actually for over 20 years at the time, where we had a field that we had parts of the field that were being grazed in the fall, parts of the field that were being grazed in the spring, and parts of it that were never being grazed. And so we did this as a no-till corn bean system, and we would graze the corn residue. And one of the things that we kept getting questions about, of course, is compaction. People are always worried about cattle causing compaction. And we looked at bulk density, so you can think about that as the porosity of the soil, as was mentioned. And we do see that with the spring grazing, we get a little bit of a shift, but it's not significant in that we get a little bit of an increase. So this is the soil depth. So we measured at 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches. And we see that we're getting a little bit denser here with the spring grazing, but we're not above the threshold where we start impacting root growth. And when we look at penetration resistance, which, you know, is how much force it takes to go through the soil, which is probably what most people would think of when they think of compaction, because it's what you would observe if you were thinking about the down pressure on your planter. Indeed, we do see this spring grazing actually shifting and increasing the penetration resistance. So in our planter, yes, we do have to increase our down pressure a little bit. However, again, we're below the threshold. So what happens is that we don't see a negative effect on our subsequent crop yields. In fact, we were seeing a significant effect, especially as fall grazing, on our crop yields. That's a positive effect, especially on our soybeans here. Of course, remember, this is a long term, so we can pick up 2 bushel if we do this continuously. And we were kind of seeing the same trend even in our corn. And I think what's going on here is we're changing some of the nutrient cycling. So we have a lot of carbon material out there. We have the cattle eating that. They're using some of that carbon. They're putting out some manure, which has a different carbon to nitrogen ratio. And we're probably helping the nitrogen cycling and helping these beans a little bit here. The other thing that we're doing is we are changing the microbes. And so we have, this is the non-grazed, this is the fall, and this is the spring. And I just compared the non-grazed to the grazed treatments. And what kind of pops is that, yes, we get a little bit more total microbes in the soil. But in particular, the 2 groups that we get more of, one was actinomycete bacteria and the other one was saprophytic fungi. These guys like to munch on hard to degrade material. So they were probably helping the nitrogen cycling as well. And so that's probably why we see some positive responses, even in our corn residue grazing situations. In terms of organic matter, we did not pick up a statistical difference in soil organic matter in this long-term study when we're just incorporating grazing. So remember, there's no cover crop involved here. So this is just the impact of having the cattle on the land. But I can kind of say, okay, we're seeing some positive trends, definitely not negative trends, which I think is important to understand. So in general, we really don't see effects on porosity. We've done a lot of different studies across the state, and we really just don't see much going on there. Sometimes we get increases in penetration resistance, especially with spring grazing. Usually, well, all of them have been below the levels that would expect to reduce yields. And the other interesting thing is we don't really see carryover from year to year. So it seems like because it's a fairly shallow effect, it gets ameliorated over time. We do reduce cover, of course, and so we've got to make sure that we don't do that so much so that we have erosion problems. We didn't see any effects on wind, erosion, soil nutrients. We really didn't see any effects when we measured those in these long-term studies. And we did increase the microbial community, as we talked about. And then we either, if it's short-term, we see no effect. Long-term, we usually are seeing slight improvements in yield, which I think is useful. Okay, so we're going to take a little journey and we're going to go to Brazil for a second. And the reason I wanted to go to Brazil is because I think this is a very interesting study where they were actually looking at, again, this is actually oats after soybeans. But they were looking at, well, if I kept my oat sward at a certain height, so 4 inches to 16 inches, what did it do to penetration resistance, which is this map? So red would be, of course, higher pressure, and green would be lower pressure that it would take to get through the soil. And what you can see is that, yes, the amount of grazing pressure did affect the amount of penetration resistance. So in this, where they were a little bit lighter and they kept it at 16 inches. So it's actively growing at that time. So they have a lower stocking density and they're keeping more material on the ground, if that makes sense. We have less change in penetration resistance. If we go really intensive, we get more. Partly because it changes how many steps the animals are taking in a day, which is intriguing, right? So at 4 inches, they're walking around a lot to get enough bites that are full to basically fill themselves up, right? And if they can get really full bites, they take them and then they go lay down and ruminate. So I think that's useful to understand because your management can affect what you're going to see on the soil. Then they also looked at microbial biomass. And of course, if we had higher stocking densities, we had more cattle, they did see more microbial biomass, which was interesting in the soil. And more basal respiration. So, that would say more activity going on. So there's a positive effect of having more cattle there. There's a negative effect when we looked at earthworm populations. So if I put cattle on there, it was positive. But if I had too many cattle or I increased the density, then I started seeing a negate of that benefit, which is really interesting to me. So some cattle really, really good. And then as I got more and more dense, probably because I'm changing how much carbon material is actually there available on the ground for them to pull, I guess, from. So I think that's kind of intriguing to me. And it says that, cattle, again, depending on your management, you're going to have differential effects on the biology in the soil. So management will affect the effects. And more cattle pressure, I mean, that's a good thing for microbial biomass if you need to get that moving. And so if you have something that's like, have a lot of carbon, for instance, and I want to get it degraded quickly, that's good. If I'm in another situation, which sometimes our producers are, where we actually don't have a lot of carbon on the soil, we don't have a lot of cover, and increasing the microbial biomass, it cycles through more quickly. Sometimes we run into problems where we don't have enough cover later in the season because we've ramped everything up. So we need to think about, like, when you're grazing, even how much cover do you want to leave, or how much regrowth do you need before you kill that cover crop? And then I think, it's kind of interesting to see that the cattle are actually, they have a positive effect on worms, but then get less effect if we increase the stocking density and maybe decrease the amount of oats that were on the ground there. Last thing I wanted to talk about, which is water infiltration, and this is probably the one that makes me cringe the most, I guess, as somebody who likes having cattle out on the ground. Of course, I'm a ruminant nutritionist, so of course I'm biased, just to be clear. But in the spring in particular, we've done some studies where we were grazing cereal rock. Okay, for us, in early spring, we don't have much of a window before our corn and beans would be planted. And so we get on there fairly early. And in this particular study, we were very aggressive and it was pretty wet that year. And so you can see we have some pugging. You can see there's not a lot of ground cover at this point. Now it did recover. Rye is amazing at coming back. If you just give it some time, it grows very rapidly. But if we look at the infiltration rate, you can clearly see that where we grazed the cover crop, we had a negative impact. Now, this may not be long-term, but it is a negative impact. And it's particularly in the spring, that's when we get a lot of our intense rains. That's probably not ideal, right? Now, on the flip, we manage it differently, and we didn't see the complete negative response that I was talking about in the previous study. In this particular study, what we see is we kind of went back to baseline. So we didn't get the benefit of the cover crop, but we also didn't go more negative, if that makes sense. So I do think in terms of timing of grazing, spring grazing does have one negative. It has a downside, and that downside is the impacts on the infiltration rate. Now, it does not seem to be, again, a cumulative thing or even long-term. I think they're probably dislodging some soil and plugging some holes. It just seems like, though, that, if we're looking for early spring infiltration, this is not ideal. We've also done a little bit with fall grazing, like on oats. And of course, this was actually a comparison of high moisture corn and corn silage. And I think everybody can look at this and go, these oats look very nice, right? We don't like this bare soil. If we graze those oats, particularly if we graze them fairly hard, What are we going to see? And in this case, we really didn't see any significant effects of either cover crop or grazing. But if you start looking at, this is high moisture corn versus silage, that's what these two bars are. And then you're comparing the no graze, the cover, or the no cover crop, the cover crop without grazing, and the cover crop with grazing. I think you kind of are seeing the same trends where we're kind of reverting back to the same as not having a cover crop, unfortunately. So the trade-offs, can you have your cake and eat it too? There's some advantages. Number one is that you get the short-term economic benefit from that cover crop, which means that you can continue to do it, right? A lot of times grazing cover crops can pay. You can increase the microbial activity in the soil, and we do see increased aggregate stability. The disadvantages, you integrate at best the infiltration benefits of the cover crop, and you'll have less soil cover. Now, this may not be a disadvantage depending on the cover crop, how much growth, and what your system is. Also, you can manage it. Like with the rye grazing, if we pull off and we give it a week, we will have something that comes up to, mid-calf up to our knee, and it'll have plenty of cover. So again, you've got to think about what are your goals. In terms of neutral, we're not seeing, strong positive impacts on soil organic matter. Of course, that's a long-term thing. And as I showed you, I mean, the trend is actually going positive, but right now we're not seeing that grazing itself without the cover crop is doing anything. And then we really do not see compaction. So it's kind of a neutral in terms of that. And with that, I will be available on the panel and we can have some greater discussion.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Drewnoski. Just refreshed all my memories from like 2016. All right. Our next speaker is Dr. Douglas Jackson Smith. He is a professor and Kellogg Endowed Chair of Agrosystems Management at the Ohio State University. He's trained as a sociologist with a significant background in geography, economics, political science, and anthropology. His work has spanned overlapping scales to better understand relative contribution of individual, household, community, institutional, and national and global drivers of farm structural change, land use transformations, and environmentally relevant behaviors. Dr. Jackson Smith, floor is yours, or screen is yours.
All right. Well, I loved it when Mary said, well, I'm not a real soil scientist, I'm an animal scientist. Well, I'm neither an animal scientist nor a soil scientist, but I lead a team and work with a group that brings a lot of different expertise to the table. And although trained as a social scientist, my niche in life has been to mess in everybody else's sandboxes and try to figure out what I can bring, certainly as a sociologist, but also how the pieces fit together. I'll be talking today about a project that I've led that was a USDA-funded project to try to take the research out into the field and look at what we observe in practice from what we think we might get from experimental work. The motivation for the project is that we see livestock and crop systems generally in the United States and around the world becoming more and more separated and specialized. A lot of good reasons for how that contributes to efficiencies and productivity, but a growing awareness of some of the challenges and limitations of having specialized systems. And as I say on the stump often, I look to the future. I think with oil prices going through the roof for the long run, fertilizer becoming shy, interests in potentially managing systems with attention more to water quality and carbon, reintegration, I think, is going to be a piece of the conversation, a bigger piece of the conversation. And getting a better handle on how reintegration could work with crop and livestock systems is something that I think a lot of us are quite interested in, obviously, today. So the big picture objectives of our project was to kind of look at and quantify the environmental, economic, and social outcomes of different approaches. And sometimes those approaches are going to be bringing manure to a crop farm, and that's the extent of the integration. Sometime it will involve kind of an integrated within the farm operation. And our focus in the field has been manure and perennials in rotation as indicators of mechanisms for integration. And we're using a lot of our field data to kind of update models and ground us. So it's not an experimental trial. We don't have replicated controlled experimental blocks. We aren't going to give you statistics in the same way. But what we did is try to go to working farms that have been in a lane for a long time and fields that have been managed in a way for a long time to see if what we see in the field represents what we would expect to see. And to what extent do we see consistency and variability in those outcomes? So bringing farmers in to give us grounded kind of reality check, and also to partner with farmers to make sense of the results. As many things as we can measure as a science team, they've got just as much information to bring to the table in terms of their lived experiences working those fields, those farms, and so we're enjoying those conversations. All right. So we picked farms that represented different degrees of integration from 2 parts of Ohio. We've got pure cash grain operations. Some never use manure. Some just bring manure in from neighboring farms. We have integrated beef and dairy operations, and we have operations that don't grow row crops. They're grazers or hay, mostly beef operations. And we focus just on cattle. So earlier, Anna showed a slide with the impacts of swine manure. Gosh, I'm dying to see a series of studies about the differences between ruminant manures and monogastric manures. But our project focused just on beef and dairy, so we were exclusively selecting fields and farms where that's the signal you're going to see. There are some differences in soils across East and Western Ohio that we did pick intentionally to be able to represent how that soil factor might weigh in. On these farms, we picked 4 kinds of fields, or we were able to select fields that had a 5, now 7-year history, often 20 or 30-year history. Class 1 fields were cash grain rotations that never get manure and had no perennials in recent memory. Class 2 fields are the same thing, but where manure is used as a soil amendment for fertility purposes, typically from a neighboring farm. And then Class 3 fields have a diverse rotation. And because these are all on livestock operations, they typically are also bringing manure into those fields. But they're distinctive in the perenniality, I think, in rotation. And finally, we have fields that only have perennials, hay or pasture. Often the distinction is blurred, where they hay some and pasture some, but fields that have a history for often many years of just being in perennials. Again, typically getting manure. Across the project, we picked 31 farms, 86 fields, 3 replicates in each field. So we're getting multiple observations to kind of give us some confidence in our numbers. And you can kind of see how the numbers of fields are spread across those different field classes. And that's important to understand all the pictures I'm going to show you next, which get after what we're seeing in fields that have these different histories. We measured a lot of things. I'm not going to share very much of it, but a lot of soil sampling across 2 field seasons. We did a lot of crop sampling to get ideas about quality and nutrient removals. Feed samples, we sampled all the manure. We can disentangle differences in terms of the content of manures. I won't do that today. And on a few fields, we actually measured the full cycle, trying to get water and air emissions to get kind of close that nutrient loop. Today, I'm just going to talk about soils, and I'm just going to talk about the part of soils that point at soil health. And Anna saved me time because A, I'm not a soil health specialist, and B, this takes time to explain what we mean by soil health, but we did measures of a whole variety of physical, chemical, and biological soil health measures. To kind of zoom in, just to give you a feel for these results, when we look at measures of aggregate stability, the clumping, the ability of soil to form aggregates that can provide environments for water infiltration and retention, but also biological activity. We saw, for example, higher levels of aggregate stability on fields as you march from field class 1 to field class 4. And if you're not big on reading histograms, the left-hand axis tells us kind of what the level of aggregation is. And the 4 categories at the bottom are fields with different management history. That black line in the middle is your typical sample. In the middle of all the samples we would get, that would be what we have in the middle of the distribution. And these are aggregated across a couple of years of observations. When you look at the sizes of those boxes, those big colored boxes, that's where half the samples are. And it's a reminder that when I give you a single number, behind that single number are quite a range of different observations. And what we see in these data is that there are wide ranges of outcomes. No matter what your field class history is we've got aggregation levels that are quite low or aggregate levels that are quite high that reflect the combination of real world management that go beyond manure and perenniality. But the general tendency is as you see more manure and perenniality, you're seeing increases in aggregate stability, which is comforting because some of the research suggested we should have found that. And it's nice to see that on average or in general, we're seeing patterns moving in the direction we go. When we look at something like cation exchange capacity, in some ways good for us, we're not seeing big differences because these are largely determined by your soils. And so the differences we see in other measures are not principally differences driven by the fact that some soils in different field classes have higher levels of clay or higher levels of basic kind of structural cation exchange capacity. When I look at things like phosphorus, a huge topic in Ohio with manure and livestock, we actually don't see significant differences in the phosphorus levels on the fields in our study based on whether or not they're applying manure or whether or not they have perennials in rotation or annual crops in rotation. Though we do see some expected jump on some of the manured diversified fields. And that probably reflects more of a 30, 40-year history than the 5 to 7 year history that we're looking at. I'm going to spend most of my slides here on biology because all the farmers we work with mainly go to measures of biology. They've seen what they've done on traditional soil tests that capture chemistry and physics. But the biology indicators are numerous, and I'm learning about new ones every year. But we looked at, for today's purposes, organic matter and several measures of active carbon and indirect indicators of the activity and presence of conditions that would be favorable to biological activity, as well as some the sheer scale of biology. When we looked at organic matter on our study fields, we do see a similar pattern to aggregate stability where we see some increases, but they're less dramatic. The range of variability in organic matter, as most of you know, if you've paid attention to your organic matter, it moves very slowly. It's hard to dramatically change organic matter on short timescales, but we do see the same kind of stair-stepping pattern. With indicators of soil respiration, which to me, the non-social scientist, is, as I describe it, the burst of activity you get when you dry out your soil and get it wet again, kind of tells you about how many bugs you got in the soil or all the activity that's brought back to life. And we do see more significant increases in soil respiration from perenniality in this case than we're seeing from just adding manure. And so we see a small bump with the manured annual crop fields between field class 1 and field class 2, but the two fields classes that have the perennial in rotation as its distinguishing feature tend to be maintaining larger communities, or at least bursts of soil respiration activity when we wet their soils. Another indicator that people have used as a metric of soil health is POC. You know, POC, as I have had explained, and Anna, correct me if I'm wrong, but is sort of the food source for what is available to biology, or some forms of soil microbiology that we think of as generating agronomically important outcomes. And we see fewer differences in POC. And in fact, if you look at the scientific literature, this is often the measure that does have the least consistent results with management, but you know, somewhat of the same pattern. And finally, soil protein, which is a measure of the nitrogen in the soil or certain forms of nitrogen that can provide food sources and indicators of biological activity. We see some increases on our study farms as well. And just as of last month, we ran some samples from 2023 through a lab down in Columbus that looks at indicators of soil enzymes. And I'm a novice on how to explain what aryl sulfatase and B-glucosidase are, but I did a little reading before this talk today, and they are, you know, indicators of what we consider to be beneficial soil biological activity and the residues and the constructs that are left in the soil that help us form aggregates, process nutrients, provide the fertility that a lot of soil biology is providing crops. And so they're seen by the community as positive indicators. And kind of interestingly, these are the indicators of soil health where we have some of the most striking results, where the jump in adding manure and the jump from adding perennials seems to be most consistent and most significant in terms of the scale of the in-the-field observations we have. All right, take homes. I think I didn't talk a lot about it here. I could show you some slides, but we see similar patterns in East versus Western Ohio, though the absolute numbers are not the same. So if you're in a soil that has a lot of clay or a soil that doesn't have a lot of clay, you should not compare your soil test results. But we see the same pattern, the same tendencies in terms of the stair-stepping improvements in soil health associated with manure. I didn't dig into it deeply or talk about it a lot, but we see a modest bump consistently from manure on most of these soil health parameters, but the biggest bump is from long-term inclusion of perennials in rotation in combination with manure. And when you think about crop and livestock integration, that's significant because we rarely meet a farmer in Ohio who has long rotations with perennials who don't have their own livestock to consume those perennials. It's not common. And the simplification of rotations is highly associated with moving livestock off farm or onto specialized operations. To get manure back on fields, there's a lot of options we have to transport manure, build relationships among farms. To get complex, diverse rotations back on farms, I think we really are talking about situations in which we either bring livestock back onto farms that don't have livestock or find ways to manage those relationships in terms of feed supplies as well as manure supplies that allow that longer rotation to make economic sense to producers. The outcomes we see are pretty consistent with literature, but when you promise a farmer that if you do this, our study shows you're going to get a 5% yield bump, or you're going to see this increase in 1% increase in organic matter, it's important, I think, to always remember that that's not always what is experienced. There's a lot of other management variables in the background. We have data on cover crops. We have data on tillage. We have data on fertilization practices. We know a lot more. And in our more sophisticated statistical models, we're trying to tease out, when you control for some of those things, how much of the effect of adding manure or adding long rotations continues and how much of it is actually explained by other things going on these farms. But all of that is part and parcel of giving good advice or having good conversations about how do you move forward, and understanding that the response people experience is going to be highly variable leads us to kind of think about what drives that variability and how can we work collaboratively to figure out how to get more consistent. So I'd say soil health benefits, and what's more important to my farmers, agronomic and economic benefits. So the things that translate into crop performance. And with that, I'm done. It's a huge team. Thanks to all these farmers who volunteered their fields and let us muck around in there for 2 seasons, and a whole lot of people.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson-Smith. I would like to thank you all, our 3 speakers, Dr. Anna Cates, Dr. Mary Drewnoski, and Dr. Jackson-Smith for their presentation and time. Dr. Cates mentioned really good resources into charts, so really look into that. That's the aggregate tool of manure laboratory analysis. And please feel free to type if you have any question in question answer chat feature. And I think we have one question is already answered, but I would like to ask Dr. Drewnoski, can you give some insights about the impact of grazing on soil health parameters?
Yeah, I think hopefully I answered that question in the seminar, but the thing that we're seeing, especially in corn residue systems, is that we have a lot of carbon available. And so having the cattle out there processing some of that I actually think is why we see such a big benefit in terms of the soil microbes and actually the crop yields. So to me, I think there's definitely a easy win when it comes to corn systems and putting cattle out on crop residue. You're not trying to balance timing or anything like that. You have that window. It's the easy way to get the integration, in my opinion. So if there was a place to start, it seems like that's the easiest place to start. And so I would say that it's worth a shot. If somebody is interested in integration, that's probably the place that would be the easiest for them to dip their toes in.
Thank you.
Dr. Jackson Smith or Dr. Drewnoski, you work with a lot of growers. What is the kind of perception you got whenever you go out to talk to integration of crop livestock system? Is it usually like, we'll go for it or not? Like, what is the major hiccup if somebody is like trying to incorporate that?
Mary, you want to go first?
Member, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
What's the perceptions that you get from crop producers when you talk about integration? Like, is there a major hiccup that you keep getting? What
Oh,
is your?
yeah. I think probably everybody knows the answer to this one. The number one is compaction. I mean, that is still the number one concern. Even after like the first, feels like almost decade of my career, that's what we were looking at, right? Because it's the number one concern. And a couple years ago, we actually did what I thought was like, okay, we're going to just do the worst case scenario. We are going to, in the spring, we're going to wait until it rains. We're going to triple stock and graze for just 2 weeks, like do everything wrong and see what happens on corn residue. And surprisingly, doing that, yes, we did increase bulk density and penetration resistance a little bit more than in the normal stocked fall grazing situation. But we still saw that we had a positive impact on our subsequent crop yields. In fact, it was even more positive than the normal grazing. And again, I think it's because, I mean, in that situation, we kind of tilled the soil. I mean, that was what it looked like. I mean, there was so much pugging. So am I suggesting doing that? No, I'm not. What I'm saying is that I think a lot of people worry a lot about the compaction, because if you do have a situation like that where it rains and you have cattle out there and the ground is thawed, you get some pugging, the surface is rough, the penetration, the amount of resistance that it has, it seems like, oh man, all is lost. And I think what we're seeing is it's so shallow that it's not really a big deal. It will come out of it, and it's not something I would worry about so much. I will point out one other thing, and that is we did that on a long-term no-till field. And some of the work we did very early on was like looking at, spring tilled versus no-tilled, and we really didn't see differences in crop responses. But I will say, in terms of the cattle side of things, that having that soil structure is very, very useful to keep them from trampling in a lot of the forage, and their performance is actually better on the no-till system. So the one thing I will couch is that my suggestion is that if you are like transitioning into no-till, you might want to make sure that you are babying in the soil a little bit in terms of only being on there when it's frozen until you get some of that soil structure.
Yeah, I didn't jump in with my 20-minute presentation about all the social factors and economic factors around farmer decision making, but 2 quick points. One is that we had farmers who have no livestock, no manure, all they do is manure and so forth. Everybody's lives make sense. They all have reasons for doing what they're doing. And it was interesting to just be reminded that for some farmers, integrated cattle and livestock is their jam, and it's working for them, and it's providing benefits. They see the complementarities, and for others, access to manure is a fundamental part of their operation, but they're really tractor people. They don't care. They don't want livestock. And I'd say we were also struck that there's not an opposition to manure. In fact, manure is pretty widely used, especially swine and poultry manure, as well as cattle manure in Ohio. A lot of fields do get manure, but it's a question of if there were concerns, I'd say weeds more than compaction, but weeds and compaction and bringing water at times of the year onto your operation if it's liquid manure. But it's more access. So whether they have a neighbor or not determines whether or not they're bringing cattle manure onto their operation, because that's a synergistic. And so infrastructure that helps build those partnerships could be very important. And adding cattle, though, is the harder thing, or adding perennials. And if there were markets for perennials, if there was a way to justify taking the economic benefits of corn and soybeans and rotating out of those 2 very valuable crops more profitable, I think a lot more people might consider doing it with or without livestock. But in the current markets and the current farm programs and the way in which we pay for rewarding people. It's not surprising that most of them don't incorporate long rotations. So I know there's a lot of work we're doing and others are doing around the country to try to figure out how to build those markets or create economic incentives. Now, high fertilizer prices in the last decade, every time you get $1,200, nitrogen prices, everybody's really interested in manure. And when prices drop, that interest wanes. If we get to a world of persistently high fertilizer prices across the board, I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about how we can better capture, manage, use nutrients that are available in agriculture right now through the livestock systems. Good.
Ms. Smith, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I'm just gonna go through a couple of slides before we close this session. So as I mentioned, we are offering soil and water management CCA credit. So you can just scan this code and submit your for credit. Also, you can use this link and fill out the form for this one. And we are gonna have next week Conservation Tillage and Technology Conference in Ada, Ohio. And also this year's e-field reports is available online. Also, you can contact your county office to get a hard copy. And thank you for attending today.
All right, thank you, everyone. Don't forget to fill the survey. It really is critical for us. Thank you.